Good morning and welcome back. Today's video is meant to discuss Session 3, the content for the third week of the Operations Management class. As you know, you're preparing to start the simulation, so I think you'll find some of the content here will be related and hopefully help you in your decision-making process and your analytics around the simulation and what decisions you make along the way. So to start with a quote, before everything else, getting ready is the secret of success, according to Henry Ford. Uh, Basically, the idea is everything is a trade-off. You've often heard the terms paralysis by analysis. This is kind of the opposite extreme. This is where you analyze things to death before you finally make a decision and do something. And oftentimes that delay can be costly. The opposite extreme is where you don't do any analysis, you don't do any formal thinking or formal review of the data. You just jump in, call the shot, make a decision. That happens often as well. What you're looking for in my mind is kind of a happy medium where you do a bit of analysis, but you monitor how you're doing along the way, see if your analysis was correct, make the necessary adjustments, and then move forward. Previously, in the previous sessions, we had talked about overall strategies for operations and competitive advantage. So this is a combination of your SOCA, your SOCA. We talked about the fact that the three most common strategies are differentiation, cost, leadership, and responsiveness. But that in reality, we find that most companies there's some hybrid, there's some combination of these and possibly other strategies. But the whole idea is that your company, your overall organization is going to have some sort of strategy, some way that you're going to guide and help make decisions going forward. Our favorite model, at least my favorite model, hopefully yours soon, is the gear model where we talk about the SO and the CA right here in the middle, your strategy of operations, your competitive advantage, driven by your company's strategy. So what is your company's reason for being? Your marketing, and hard to see here, your finance are tied to that. But we see that your SO and CA are intimately linked to your company's strategy, and then your different decisions of operations management around the outside here are driven off of those strategies collectively. So the whole idea is everything has to be working together as a cohesive unit. Process strategies. Process strategies, these are the actual activities within the operation, whether it's a product focus or a service focus. What are the processes that help you deliver your product, whether it's a physical product or an actual service? Common process strategies include process focus, repetitive focus, product focus, and mass customization. Talked a little bit about those in the past, and you've probably read up on those. Process focused is where the process is the key, not so much the product. When you think about process focus, you might think of pipelines, you might think of chemical plants. Think about Starbucks, you could argue, was a process focus idea because, again, the product is important, but the overall process, the arrangement of the store, the experience is a key part of it. Repetitive focus is the classic manufacturing model of the factory that's pumping out cars or Dixie cups or whatever product they're making. Product focus is where you're primarily focused on the product itself. So the product is the primary reason, the primary definition of the process. You'll find that oftentimes with services where the delivery of the service is the primary and only focus. And then finally, mass customization, which is a bit of an oxymoron in a traditional sense. Mass customization is the idea where every product is different, just like every other product. So it's kind of the thing about snowflakes. Every snowflake is different, just like every other snowflake. The whole idea of mass customization can be seen, used to be in the auto industry, where you decided what car you wanted, you sat down with a salesperson, figured out what options you wanted, what color, engine size, what have you, and then they would produce the car based on your request. And they did this in mass quantities. Another example might be some computer manufacturers. You go online and you can order the computer you want, customize it, and they deliver it the way you want it. So those are examples of the four most common, certainly not the only processes, but the most common processes out there. And again, most organizations have some combination thereof. Process design. How do you figure out how to manage and control your process? The tools that you typically use are flow diagrams, where you have a flow chart showing step 1, step 2, step 3, how they're linked, how they're organized. If you recall, the opening window of the Littlefield simulation is basically a flow diagram. You can see the flow of the product through the organization, the different process steps, the different stations along the way. Time function process mapping is where I take that basic flow diagram and I add time to it. So I might have different windows. The length of an arrow on a flow diagram might be indicative of how long that process takes, or the size of a box might be. And then process charts, value stream mapping. Value stream mapping is very common, and the whole concept is, once I've defined my overall process, what items within that process are considered value added. In other words, a classic example is if the customer would pay more for that item, that's value add. If you take away that item and it doesn't affect the price that the customer is willing to pay, it's obviously not added value to the customer. And then finally, service printing with Poka-Yoke at the bottom is kind of a unique process. The idea of service blueprinting with Poka-Yoke is the idea that I have a step-by-step function, and I've got things in the process that ensure that I can't skip a step. I can't go to step 3 without completing steps 1 and 2. And so Poka-Yoke is the idea of making it foolproof. A simplest example I can think of is if you have a 3-prong electrical plug and you've got the 3-prong outlet in the wall, there's only one way to stick that plug into the wall. And that's a Poka-Yoke design, and that's the concept is you can only do something physically one way. I mean, obviously you can hit it with a hammer long enough, you get it to work, but the idea of that. So if you think in the old days we had 2-prong plugs where the 2 prongs were the same size, you could put the plug in either way. That was not a Poka-Yoke design. And so you see that with a lot of products. You can only assemble certain one way. And people do that in the product design and in service design to ensure that important steps are not missed along the way. Here's an example of value stream mapping. You can see from left to right, we start with the supplier of goods, going to a machine, going to another component mounting operation, assembly, test, and packaging, and then out the door. Then we have some supervisor in the middle and the overall management of manufacturing at the top. But if you look at this, what we see is there's 2 lines down here. I talk about how long the cycle time is to complete each process. So 5 days to get started, 3 days from step 1 to step 2, 6 days from the start of step 2 to the start of step 3, and on out. But in reality, within this operation, only 45 seconds is value add on any given component. The reason it takes so long is you can see along the way we have 1,500 items passing from process to process. Well, the fact that I complete the work on 1,500 items before I pass them on to the next stage obviously holds up the entire flow. This is where the concept came of lot size of 1, which is something you may be familiar with. The idea is if machine 1 finishes one part, pass it on to machine 2. As soon as machine 2 finishes one part, pass it on to machine 3. And the idea here is that that first part literally could get through in, if you look at it, maybe a couple of minutes as opposed to a number of days. So obviously from a cycle time standpoint, that's a great strategy. And again, tying back to what is your key principle for being here. Here's an example of a process chart. Little different approach. I'm not in love with this approach, but just do see it common. This is an idea of building a hamburger assembly process. This is, I've got a meat patty, I'm putting it in the broiler, I inspect it, I have temporary storage, I add the bun, the lettuce, etc., and send it out. So the whole idea here is how many feet did the hamburger travel? And so one of the things you see in processes is how do I minimize the number of feet that the product travels? So because again, traveling from point A to point B doesn't add any value. Is the hamburger any better because I walked it around the room a little bit? No. So the concept is, well, if I take the hamburger, put it right on the grill from storage, right on the bun, and right to the customer's hands, that's kind of the fastest way, the most efficient way, productive way I can do it. Aggregate planning is another piece. We talk about operations management and planning horizons. We've talked about the fact that the most expensive activities tend to be the longest out, which are the hardest to forecast. So it's kind of a trap that way. The short-term things are easy to predict. If I have a restaurant short-term, if I look out and all the tables are full and there's a line going out the door, I know exactly where I'm at. But it's the hardest to react to. I certainly can't add another room to the restaurant. I can't add more tables. I can't add another kitchen while those people are waiting outside. So all those things are more of a long-term activity. But again, can I tell, maybe it takes me 3 to 6 months to do all that, can I tell that that business will still be there 3 to 6 months from now? A little tougher to forecast. So planning process, again, the longer the range, typically the more expensive, where I have capital investment, is where the higher level folks in the organization are going to be involved. Short range, the people on the floor, of the restaurant, people on the floor of the factory are going to be making those decisions. So I have aggregate planning, and basically the idea of aggregate planning, like the word says, is to bring all the pieces together. I'm going to aggregate all the information I have. So I take all the information. I take customer forecasts. I have trends in the business. I have seasonality based on past activity. All these things. Maybe some new product is coming out. I take all those inputs and tie it together and create what is, in effect, a master plan for my systems, which then drives what I'm going to do. How many people I'm going to have in the restaurant, number of servers, number of cooks, whatever, number of people I'm going to have on the floor in the factory, how much material am I going to bring in the restaurant, how much food am I bringing in from my suppliers in the factory, how many pounds or dollars worth of raw goods am I bringing in order to get the work done. So again, I tie all these pieces together. The aggregate planning helps me plan everything along the way. And then obviously I know that my planning, again, based on forecasts are an estimate, not always correct. What do I do? And typically, number one, especially in the product side, is using inventories. If I'm not sure about variability, I build some up. If you walk into the grocery store today, what do you see? If you go get a loaf of bread, what do you see? A lot of bread on the shelf. That's all inventory. In the ideal world, if I'm the bakery, the bread that the customer wants is just coming out of the oven and is handed to the customer as they walk in the store. But since I don't know what everybody wants, I have to have things on the shelf in order to meet their needs. So ideally, I want to have a few items on the shelf. In the ideal world, I don't have more than a handful of items on the shelf in order to meet the needs. And then changes with varying workforce size. Again, if you're in a service business especially, workforce is one of your key elements that you can change to adapt to changing strategies or to changing realities that your plan didn't quite capture. So I can call up people and say, hey, can you come in today? Or I can walk up to people at lunchtime and go, gee, would you mind taking the afternoon off? Things are kind of slow. And then part-timers, overtime, idle time to absorb changes. One of the places I worked is we had training built in a couple hours a week. And the idea was, if there was time, the employees went to training. If there was excess activity on the floor and we couldn't do it, they just didn't do training that week, and maybe they caught up the following week. But you could do things like that. And while they're in training, are they being productive? Technically not, but it's something that's important for the development of the organization, rather than having them stare out the window or sitting around doing things that are not value add. Subcontractors are a big thing. The idea of subcontractors is, I can partner with somebody else and let them absorb the variability. If I have too much work, I give the overflow to them. If I don't have enough work, I pull work out of their organization. And then finally, influencing demand. Can I change the demand for the organization? Why do you think a lot of places, restaurants will have deals on Mondays or Tuesdays, or they might even close on Mondays? Why? Because Mondays aren't very busy for most restaurants. So the whole idea is I can just close, accept the fact that business is going to be light and just close. Or I can offer a sale. If 10% off if you come in on Monday and have the dinner special, whatever. So the whole idea is I can influence the demand. Not easily, but oftentimes I can. If I have, back to my reference of a barbershop, if I have a barbershop and I have too many people in there, I can sit there and say, look, you can wait, or I'll give you a coupon to come back tomorrow, half off or something like that if you come back tomorrow. So I can shape the demand a little bit around what's really going on, whether I have too much demand or not enough demand at any given time. So again, I can change inventory levels. I can vary the workforce size by hiring or doing layoffs. Those are more long-term activities. I can vary production rates through overtime or idle time. In other words, I can pay overtime. Disadvantage, obviously, that costs money. I can wear out folks. One of the case studies, you'll see an example where they push people a little too hard, too much overtime, and it kind of burned them out If anything, even with overtime, they were getting less productive than what they were without overtime. So again, the whole idea, subcontracts, sounds like a good thing. Again, you're paying somebody else, so part of your profit is going somewhere else. The other big risk is I've seen a lot of cases over time where your subcontractor turns into one of your competitors. Subcontractor, you train them, you help them get ready to build your product. Obviously, you want them building your product with the same level of quality that you have. And then ultimately, they look at it and go, well, geez, I can go get the material from the suppliers and sell this stuff just as easily as the next guy, and then I get the whole profit myself. So we've seen that happen as well. Part-time workers, again, easy to do. Quality isn't always as good. Depends on the type of job. The less skill required, the easier it is to put a temp person in there. Higher skill, that might require longer training, is tough. Again, influencing demand, always an option. And then back ordering during high demand periods. So is the customer willing to wait? Like the barbershop option earlier. So if I go to the customer and say, look, will you accept a late shipment? Is it critical that you have the product delivered in one day? In our modern world with all the shipping capabilities that we have, going online and ordering things, we're kind of used to this, instant results kind of approach. So we go in and we order something and we expect it to be on the truck on our way to our house the next day. But that's a problem because it's very difficult, unless you have the item in stock already, difficult to manage your manufacturing capability. So you might sit there and go, well, look, we'll give you a discount if you wait longer. And I've seen this on a few products. It's not very common. I've run into it on occasion on a website. Say, okay, if I want immediate delivery, it costs me this much. If I can wait a week, it'll cost me this much. And that's just basically the manufacturer trying to control their demand and giving you a discount, at the same time level loading their factories a little more effectively. And then the bottom item here, countering seasonal products and services. This is pretty obvious. You've probably seen this before. This is the idea that the guy that sells canoes in the summer sells skis in the winter, or the company that does lawn mowing in the summer does snow plowing in the winter. And the whole idea is that if I I've got all these employees, I've got facilities, I've got equipment sitting idle, why not take advantage of some other product that's complementary in some way with the original product that I have that just varies by season. Mixing options to develop a plan. Again, chase strategy, level strategy, and some combination thereof. The chase strategy is basically you match the output rates to demand forecasts for each period. So the whole idea is that I'm going to vary things. If my forecast says products or volume's going to go up, I'm going to increase capacity, add more equipment, add subcontractors, add people, whatever. If my forecast says things are going down, do the opposite. The level strategy is that basically I'm going to do the same thing every day, one way or the other, period. And this is kind of a productivity-focused strategy. The idea is I've got a factory that's designed, for example, to build 10 cars a day. I'm going to build 10 cars a day. If I don't build enough cars, well, the customer's going to have to wait. Or if I build too many cars, well, they're going to go sit out at the dealership, and we'll get rid of them eventually anyway. But the whole idea is to optimize your factory operations. That'll minimize your cost, improve your quality, etc. And then people get used to it. In the old days, this was unheard of. Toyota was one of the first companies to come up with this model. So a lot of times, if you buy a car at Toyota, and I think this is starting to happen with Honda as well, you don't go in and order a car. You go in and tell them what you want, and they tell you when that car is going to fall off the boat. So the whole idea is they've got an entire process in place. They build cars, they ship them to the U.S. by boat typically, and then they haul them cross country from the West Coast to here, for example. And they just have this long list that says, okay, what color RAV is with air conditioning and this size engine, all this other stuff. They have this mix based on their forecast. And one of the things I've seen is if you go in there and you ask for what is probably an oddball type of car that is maybe not very high on their forecast list, they may look at you and go, we don't have one. There won't be one. And there's, they go back in the list of all the cars that are either have been built or in the pipeline or are about to be built, and they just say, look, we don't have one. Sorry, you're out of luck. Would you rather have one of these, that is more common, maybe a more common color or a more common set of options? And that's one of the ways they do that. we're used to more of an on-demand approach, but that strategy can work very well and has worked very well for Toyota, for example. And as I mentioned, typically, these things are often just a combination of the above. In services, little different animal, but the same rules and policies can apply. So controlling cost of services is important because oftentimes the vast majority of your cost is made up of labor. So the whole idea is, with a product, I have labor involved typically, but I also have components that I have to purchase. But for services, labor, having on-demand labor, for example, is very important. So the whole idea is that I can, I might have some employees that are always there, and I may have some employees who, I call them up and say, hey, can you come in? And that's very important. And again, the flexibility of individual workers if I have a service. So if I have a person who can only do a certain type of work, they're not as valuable to me as a person who can do a lot of different things. Because again, I can use that person more effectively to handle changes in my demand. And so the rate of output or hours of work. So how do I manage that? Can I get more done with fewer people in less time, or can I have people work overtime? Again, you'll see that. In my youth, I know when dinosaurs roamed the earth, for housing construction, it was very, very uncommon to see people working weekends and nights. But anymore, you see it all the time. And companies do that. They sit there and say, well, look, I've got a deadline. The weather was bad. I got to get the house out. I'm running behind schedule. I'll have you guys work. You see construction teams working nights and weekends to try and catch up on a project. Or just because even if they don't have to catch up, the bottom line is when the house is done, then I get my money. So if I can get the house done a little bit sooner, I may decide to pay a little overtime to some key workers if I can get something done in the meantime. So this is just a different model for services, but the same basic concepts. Yield management. Allocating resources to customers at prices that will maximize yield or revenue. Best way to summarize this is think about riding on an airplane. Demand fluctuates, capacity is relatively fixed. By that I mean I have X number of seats on X number of airplanes with X number of crews flying between X number of airports. I have a relatively fixed number. Now maybe a plane might break down, or a crew might get sick, or things might be delayed because of the weather or something like that. But in general, I have a fixed capacity. So I can change things by changing the cost. You see it on all these ads for hotels and airfare where they say that if you're sitting on an airplane, no two people around you have paid the same amount. And that happens. Very early on, they may sit there and say, if you get your ticket early enough, you may pay less because you're helping them in their future longer-term demand forecast. And then finally, you have this thing where the cost goes up, goes up, goes up, and then the closer you get. But then at the last second, if there are empty seats, you might get an incredible deal if you, as the customer, are willing to take that risk. So, the airline company, they want to fill every seat. But so they may sit there and say, if you wait till the last second, there might be an empty seat. My wife and I have done the same thing with theater tickets, where we've gone in and sometimes theaters will have empty seats. And at the last second, I've gotten some really nice theater tickets in downtown Chicago for roughly half price because we waited until the last second. But on the majority of the occasions, we do that, and they go, sorry, nothing available. So you go out to a nice restaurant, and that's the end of the night. But again, it's a question of what kind of risk as the customer are you willing to accept. And then companies can adjust, do their yield management by changing cost to drive customer activity or customer decision process. Here's an example mathematically of how this works. This is an example of a hotel room. So I sit there and say, okay, I have a room that's $150. Variable cost of the room is $15. And those of you who read ahead or understand these concepts, basically it means the hotel is sitting there anyway. I've got a crew of folks sitting there anyway. If I get somebody in that room, it only costs me $15 more. But I get $150 by having somebody in that room. So that's my value. That's my contribution. The price times the delta between the variable cost and the variable profit, if you will. Not the profit, but the variable sales. So you look at this and you go, okay, well, if I charge somebody, because what we're saying here, here's the demand curve. This is the demand based on how many rooms I'm going to fill versus what price. So if I continue to charge 150, and again, these are all forecast estimates, no guarantee that this is actual, but this is your best guess. So for 50 rooms, if I charge $150 a room. But if I charge $15, I can fill 100 rooms. Well, I don't want to charge less than $15 because I'm losing money unless there's some other reason that I want to do that. But in general, I don't want to charge less than $15. But I look at this and go, okay, some people who were charged 150 were actually willing to pay more. Maybe they got here at the last minute. And some people, if you just said, well, I'll make it 140, would have stayed. If I made it 100, would have stayed. So this money in this triangle is passed up contribution. So in other words, I could have made more money just by lowering the price. Now clearly, the people who are up here who are willing to pay more than 150, I don't want to lower the price for them. So this is this game of, well, if I lower the price, I'll get more folks. Does that get me more profit? So ideally, I want to go into a model where I do this with smaller and smaller steps. So now I have my $15 break even, $100, and $200. But my 150 is now gone. And the more I segment this, the closer I'm going to get. For those of you who are mathematically inclined, you'll realize that if I have smaller and smaller segments, these little triangles will get smaller and smaller, and more of the area under this curve will turn into profit for my company. So that's why airlines end up with these multitude of pricing arrangements, as opposed to you pay this amount for a ticket. The yield matrix, price versus duration of use. Prices tend to be fixed, prices tend to be variable. Duration of use, unpredictable, predictable. For example, movies. I can pretty much predict after 2 hours people are going to leave. Stadium for an event like a sporting event. Hotel meeting space. I have a contract. You come in on Tuesday, you're leaving Wednesday. You come in on Friday, you're leaving Monday. Whatever. Tends to be variable. Hotels. I have some reservations. That's predictable. I have airline reservations. That's predictable. Rental cars, cruise lines. So this is somewhat predictable, but the pricing tends to vary. So hotel, airlines, rental cars, cruise lines, I'm going to get different pricing depending on how and when I make my reservation. As opposed to a movie, pretty much, you can get some discounts here and there, but in general, people are all paying the same amount for that movie. Unpredictable and fixed prices, restaurants. Generally everybody in the room is paying the same for a hot dog or a hamburger or a steak or what have you. Golf course is the same sort of thing. Continuing care hospitals, unpredictable and variable. Do I know how many people are going to be in the hospital at a given time? How many people are going to leave? How many people are going to be joining us? Difficult. And then the pricing as a result can tend to be variable. How do you make this work? You can have this. Remember I mentioned about the idea of having multiple little boxes under the curve, multiple pricing structures. But it has to make sense. There have been a lot of complaints against the airline industry because people see this and they go, oh my God, why, this makes no sense to me. And then forecasts and changes in demand. You have to understand this. And again, if you have changes in demand, that's the best way you're going to make these things work. You have to adapt. And so again, yield management is going to work for you if you understand what's going on, makes sense to the customer. So for example, as a customer, if I walk into a hotel at the last minute on a rainy night and I'm tired, I'm more likely to understand that I have to pay more as opposed to some other environments that I might be dealing with. So now I want to switch gears a little bit, talk about location strategies. You've often heard the term location, 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 and that's where we're at. Location strategy is one of the most important decisions a firm can make. It's increasingly global, has a huge impact on fixed and variable costs, and is made relatively infrequently. The objective is to maximize the benefit to the firm. So if you think about location strategies, you don't do this very often. How often are you going to build a new facility or open up a new office? Especially when you think about large infrastructure involved in some major factories. It's not something you're going to do all the time. So that's a problem because, again, we talked about the fact that these things are longer term out. I know of clients that have worked, they come up with a perfectly good location strategy, they build the factory, and by the time they're done building the factory, the rules have changed. and maybe the factory is not as valuable as it once appeared to be. Decisions are made relatively infrequently. Another disadvantage, because if you make a decision frequently, well, then I can make a decision, get the results, and decide if my decision was a good one. And so I can adjust my decision-making process. Since I don't do this very often, harder to adjust unless I'm working with others in the industry. And this is why oftentimes you use a firm that's dedicated to doing location strategy type of work. But again, huge impact on fixed and variable costs. Fixed costs are obvious. The cost of the building, the cost of your utilities, things like that. Variable costs can be all over the place too. What about my labor? What about my suppliers? I've got a bunch of key suppliers. Now I have to ship the product in, or are they going to develop a local facility? A lot of activity involved, a lot of impact involved. You start at the top. Which country are you going to build in? Are you going to build in the U.S.? Are you going to build in China? Are you going to build in Mexico, Argentina, anywhere in Europe, anywhere in the world, literally? Political risks, government rules, cultural, economic issues, locations of your markets. I worked with a client for a long time, and this was a number of years ago, but before transportation was so readily available. What they did was they pretty much looked where they had key customers and reasonably sized markets, and they located a factory there. That way the factory was feeding the local customers. You could deal more effectively with local cultural and economic issues. Plus, the local governments liked it. If I'm a local government, I like the fact that my citizens are employed. I'm getting taxes out of the deal for product that's being sold in my country. I like that. And then you don't have to deal with imports, import taxes, etc., a lot of shipment, etc., etc. But what about labor talent? What about productivity? I saw one case where an electronics company built a factory in an area, great potential with one minor problem. There was literally no one in the area that had the skills to work in an electronics factory. So they took a bold move. They actually built a university campus in coordination with another college in the country to train people. So they created their own labor pool locally, and it was very, very successful because there were a lot of people available locally that had very strong skills, but just didn't have the right training. And so they were able to really develop a great partnership with the local country and make things happen. Exchange rates and currency risks are always a biggie. This is always a problem. When you think about your margins, well, could the exchange rate change by more than the percentage of your margins? Sure it could. And I've seen that happen. And now you can bank against that where you have agreements where I can work with an insurance company or a banking company and say, okay, I'm going to pay to confirm or fix a certain exchange rate, and then I'm going to help myself a little bit that way. But if the exchange rate goes the other way, then you've lost on that deal. And then typically these agreements are only good for a year or two, and then what are you going to do the following year? So it's a good short-term problem to handle the near-term bumps in the road, but maybe another problem on long-term. Then I have region. In this example, let's say you pick the U.S. Now let's talk about the upper Midwest. Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio. A lot of things that these states have in common. So if I look at this region versus the Northeast versus the Southeast, Southwest, the West, Northwest, different regions of the U.S., for example, are different. And you're going to find this anywhere in the world. One of the mistakes a lot of companies make is assuming some sort of commonality. So if you go to China, for example, various regions in China are all very different. And India, the same thing. Unless you're working with a very, very, very small country, chances are you're going to have regional differences within the area that have to be accounted for. You can't make a simplistic design and look at what's going on and assume it's going to be the same everywhere. And then I get into location, very specific site locations. So I pick which region. So in the previous example, maybe I pick Indiana. Maybe I'm going to clean it down to Indianapolis. Now, where in Indianapolis do I put it? Do I put it somewhere near the airport? Maybe I need to have products shipped in and out by air. Maybe I put it near a railroad because my product is large and bulky. Maybe near a highway or even a waterway system. But then I get into things like zoning and cost. Because a lot of times the areas that are attractive industrially are very high cost. You're competing with other companies for the same space. And then finally, environmental impact. If I look at this, is my business one that may have an environmental impact? Maybe it's not, but it's got, shall we say, a bad name, that people don't want that business in their neighborhood. So this is an index. This is a little bit old, but some of the numbers have varied, as you can see. You'll know from your own experience. But global competitiveness. So what countries are competitive? Switzerland, US, Japan, Canada, UK, Israel, China, Italy, India, Mexico, and Russia. And so you can see the relative rankings over time. But the thing I want to draw your attention to is look at the numbers, how much they changed. You know, Russia became more and more open after the Soviet Union broke up. But you know, we see things are starting to tighten up a little bit more. Same thing with China. China was more open, a few years ago than it is today. So things vary over time. And again, since this is a long-term decision, boy, how do you predict these kind of activities, and how do you predict this kind of change, and whether or not it's going to impact the effectiveness of your business? Corruption, always an interesting thing. So this is a ranking in 2011, so it's a little older, but and you could argue different things. And again, like I said before, it's hard to generalize about a country. There are parts of the U.S. that are more corrupt than others. There are, certainly parts of that, that's true in almost every country. But a lot of this has to do with the culture, has to do with the local laws. So it gives you an idea of some of these markings, where you're at. So interesting, we like to think about the U.S. being this free market a place that everything is above board, but the message here is, not always. So you can see what's going on here about different places, the amount of corruption, things going on. And you can argue, again, I've done a lot of business in China, and I didn't see it as this bad. But clearly doing business in Germany and the UK is a whole lot more streamlined and less likely to run into problems than you will in some other countries. Clustering of companies is another thing. My best example of this is, you look at theme parks in Orlando. Once Disney built there, everything else popped up around there. It's a good place. If you think about it, if you're Universal Studios or some other theme park, why do you want to build next to Disney? Because they've already got people getting there. They've drawn people to the area. And so maybe sit there and go, well, if they spend 4 days at Disney and 1 day with us, that's cool. And we don't have to do as much advertising because Disney's drawn them to the area. The hotels were already built. The restaurants were already built. So again, I can tie this all together. Plus, if I need to hire somebody who understands how to work at a theme park, Disney's already built up quite a few folks to do that. So, when Disney first built in Orlando, they had a very difficult time finding enough employees from a construction standpoint, from a managing the operations standpoint, but also the day-to-day people needed to keep the thing afloat. But now that they've done it, hey, take advantage of it. Electronics firms in northern Mexico, computer hardware manufacturers in Singapore and Taiwan. But this comes at a risk as well. If you think about it, one of the things that happened is there was a major flooding, I believe, a couple years ago in Thailand. And it turns out there's this one little area that basically made hard drives, which is the data storage device inside of most laptops and larger computers. And they were all built in the same neighborhood. So when this neighborhood was underwater, basically computer supplies dried up because no one could get hard drives. So kind of shows the weakness of this. You also saw a lot of electronics components were built in Japan in the same area that you had the tsunami and the nuclear generation facility problems. So that whole area was blocked off. So again, where do you get your components? So this can be a risk from a global standpoint. When I do location analysis, typically it's based on volume. And what do I see here? This is an example from a client that looked at Akron, Bowling Green, and Chicago as locations. And again, it depended on the volume. So higher volume favored Chicago. My guess is you have, well, if you look at it, you have higher initial cost. $110,000 to get started in Chicago, or only $30,000 to get started in Akron. I don't know, this must be a fairly small location startup. But anyway, the point is that what if you're running at 900? So you pick Akron, and all of a sudden your sales go up and you're at 1100, and gee, you wish you'd pick Bowling Green. So you have to not only look at where your current numbers are, but also where your forecast is going to go. Obviously, you hope that you're going to have growth, but it's going, if you're at 900, maybe Bowling Green is the best choice because you're expecting a reasonable amount of growth. But are you expecting growth to get you to 2,500 units? That makes Chicago a better choice? Maybe, maybe not. Again, the issue of long-term forecasting versus location. Center of gravity method, again, this is a location of distribution center that minimize distribution costs. So again, maybe your operating costs are higher, but your distribution costs are lower. So you got to look at where your marketplace is, the volume of goods being shipped, the shipping cost, and or related to distance. And there are different mathematical models that can do this that are available. So again, you can look at this and say center of gravity is at a certain location. Well, the problem is that the center of gravity might be out in the middle of nowhere somewhere. And if you look at this map based on Chicago, Atlanta, Pittsburgh, and New York, it looks like it's possibly somewhere in Ohio. I don't know. I'm just guessing. So, but you look at that and it's like, okay, from a distribution standpoint, maybe that's the best location optimally. But for a number of other reasons, maybe it isn't. Maybe you can't get labor. Maybe you can't get property. Maybe transportation in and out of the place for your suppliers is a problem. So again, this is just one aspect that has to be taken into account, not the only decision. Then I have the transportation model, and I have what's called linear programming problems. So the whole idea is I have a model that defines everything, and I apply software algorithms to try and optimize the location. Here's an example of Volkswagen, and this is their distribution and supplier map. The whole idea is anything with a number 1. So you can see here there's a 1 and a 3, a 1 and a 3. Here's a 1. Basically, a 1 is a finished vehicle. Car's all done. So I'm shipping cars from Germany to Canada. I'm shipping cars from the U.S. to Canada. I'm shipping cars from Germany to the U.S. But then I have vehicles for assembly. So I've got all the parts that are waiting for final assembly. So I'm shipping those from Mexico to Nigeria. I'm shipping parts from Germany to Nigeria. I'm shipping parts from Mexico to Nigeria. So I'm shipping things all over the place. And then assemblies, engines, suspension units. So if you think about it, parts turned into assemblies, turn into vehicles for assembly, turns into finished vehicles. And it gives you an idea of the flow. At first glance at this, you look at this, it's like, oh, how does this make any sense? And clearly this is only a subset of what's going on, because if you look at it, things ship into Nigeria and nothing ever leaves. So this is clearly not the whole model. But the whole idea is you have to analyze all these things. These models can get pretty complex. Now look at this, you say, okay, well, if anything happens in Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, South Africa, Nigeria, Shanghai, or I don't know, it looks like possibly Japan, maybe my model starts to head off on me and I need to change it. Service location. So again, the previous discussion was more about physical products. Now let's talk about services. Generally, services are delivered in a tightly customer-focused area. So what does that mean? If I'm going to give you a haircut, I can't be giving you a haircut from Singapore. If you're sitting in Chicago, I can't be offering you restaurant food as a service to you where I'm serving you the food if you're in California and I'm in Ohio. So the whole idea is a lot of this is very customer centric. So a lot of times service organizations, you're not going to find massive transportation of services or supporting goods and people, because it's just not of value. The idea of building a car in Mexico that is less expensive than building it here can make sense, but I can't ship things around that way. Quality, competition in the area, quality of the competition. Again, where am I going to put my service? If I look at this, sometimes I think about the concept of like Home Depot and Menards. One of the things you'll notice, Home Depot builds a store. Shortly thereafter, Menards builds one down the street. You see the same thing with McDonald's and Burger King. Somebody builds a McDonald's somewhere, Burger King shows up down the street. And why do you do that? Well, very simply, McDonald's does all the heavy lifting. They do all the hard work as far as figuring out the location. And then Burger King goes, well, if McDonald's thinks that's a good place, it must be, so let's just move it down the street, hoping to draw off some of their customers and some of their money. So again, how do you tie it together? quality of management, quality of staff. Again, if I want to put a service in a location, I have to have the right people. People quality is very important in services because with most services, people are directly involved with the customer. So I'm going to be talking to the customer. If you think about it, if I run a restaurant, who is the person that talks the most with the customer? Well, the server. The manager hardly ever talks to the customer, maybe on the way in, maybe on the way out, maybe a howdy on the way through. The people in the back room, the cooks, the chefs, the people doing the prep work, etc., they're not talking to the customer. So it's the face of the server that is the face of the customer. So they are the people that interact with the customer. They're the people that the customer thinks of. You probably thought about it yourself, where you've gone back to a restaurant because of the relationship you developed with a certain server. I know that happens all the time. So the whole idea is that the quality of people in the service industry is very, very, very important. You know, if I have a big factory sitting there, I may have somebody that's really good at putting parts together, but has a bad attitude, can't get along with people. Well, from a customer standpoint, that's fine as long as they can put the product together. You know, I don't have a problem with that. But if that person was interacting with a customer, you know, that might be a problem for the customer and thus our company. Then finally, I have these thing called geographic information systems. This is a very complex model. Again, some companies have these. Some people, you know, you can go to a consulting house to take advantage of something like this. It's a very complex model. The whole idea is that it takes a lot of factors. The availability of labor, the availability of customers, transportation, weather, takes all kinds of factors into place, and then looks at this and says, okay, how do I optimize the location? You can also see here on the map, it also talks about where your competitors are. Major highways, primary roads, etc. So again, how do I get my product in? How do I get my product out? Where's my competition? Do I have to worry about them? You know, etc. And again, we talk about time frame. So for Littlefield, one of the things you're going to get the chance to, you're not going to get to add facilities, just like we just talked about, but you can schedule work and you can add equipment and allocate machinery. So again, you're going to be dealing with intermediate and short-range planning. So when you talk about short-range planning, limited options exist. So scheduling objectives, again, related to Littlefield. Meet your commitments. So if you say I'm going to ship it in a week, ship it in a week. Minimize your lead time, minimize your setup costs or setup time, minimize work in process inventory. So again, if I have a bunch of product on the floor, you've paid for all that raw material and you haven't made a dime. So I want to get that product off the floor, out to the customer. And so that's the whole idea. And then maximizing machine utilization. Well, that's a balancing act. Because if I keep this machine busy, what do I have to do? I have to build up a lot of product ahead of time so that I never run out of material feeding into the process. Maybe I don't need that machine all busy all the time. We saw the example in the goal where they talked about the one automated machine that they wanted to optimize, but they did that at the cost of all the other processes around it. And so I think you saw in the book, hopefully you've gotten that far, I'm not ruining the story for you, but you see in the book that maybe optimizing one machine isn't the best. But again, so you can't just pick one of these things and say, oh, I'm going to do that, I'll be successful. No, it has to be a combination of these things, keeping all of these aspects in mind. And then I have maintenance and reliability. And maintenance isn't the idea of sweeping the floors, keeping the place clean. Maintenance is more of how are things running? How is my reality versus the optimum situation versus when I started? So for example, if I have a machine and it used to put out 100 parts an hour, does it still put out 100 parts an hour? Whatever quality level it used to have, does it still have that quality level? And that's really the idea of maintenance and reliability. Can I count on these things? My employees, they had a certain productivity level. Are they still at that productivity level? Or as the processes and technology have evolved, are the employees keeping up with it? So failure of these things can have a bad effect. Dissatisfied customers, bad reputation, bad operation, idle employees, profits becoming losses, and reducing the value of the plant. So, I mean, you can think of some very simple things. So if I have a machine and I'm supposed to maintain it, maybe change the oil, use a car maybe as an example. If I'm supposed to change the oil every so often, the car's going to break down if I don't. Or it's going to get worse mileage. And when the car breaks down, so if I think of the example of a rental car agency, if the cars are breaking down, I'm going to have dissatisfied customers. I'm going to get a bad reputation. People are going to go elsewhere. I'm going to lose profit. Remember that volume curve. So, ideally, as a business operator, I'm thinking, my volume's going to keep going up because I'm doing a great job. People are going to keep coming to me. But if I don't, and people start leaving, all of a sudden I go from profit to loss. The easiest example I can think of is think about a rental property. If you've ever owned a rental property, if you keep up the place, you can draw a better class of renter. People are going to pay their rent on time, et cetera, et cetera. When people leave, it's going to be easier to attract new renters, and so it's an overall good situation. If the opposite is the case, you're going to draw people that maybe aren't the best renters. Maybe they're going to damage the place. Maybe they're not going to pay on time. And very quickly, if renters don't pay, it doesn't take very long before all of a sudden you're losing money on the deal. And then if you have to evict them, oh my gosh, the costs and everything else involved with that are even worse. It's the same thing with almost any operation. You got to keep control of it. You got to keep things on track. Think about a restaurant. You go to a restaurant, and we've often talked about the parking lot analogy. So you look at the parking lot. A new restaurant opens, there's a few cars in the lot. So you think, oh, it must not be too bad. And there's a few more cars in the lot. It keeps growing and growing because people see the place is full, and it's, must be a good place to go. But then the opposite, something happened. All of a sudden you see it's not as full, and then pretty soon it's a little less full. And there's fewer and fewer cars in the lot, and the next thing you know, there's a for sale sign on the place. Typically, that's because they've lost track of what was going on. Now, maybe they pushed for more money, more profits. Maybe a key employee left. If it's a restaurant, maybe it's a server that everybody loved, or maybe it's a chef in the back that just did a super job and just made everybody happy. So it can be any number of things. But you'll see it with maintenance. You can often tell. You go into a place and the bathrooms are dirty, or there's trash on the floors in the restaurant, or things like that, or the tables aren't clean. Well, you know pretty quickly that from a maintenance and reliability standpoint, from a service standpoint, the company's not up to snuff. So maintenance involves keeping everything in working order. Reliability is the probability that a machine or process will function properly for a specific time. So again, you can think of the services. Reliability is more or less that, can I deliver the right service? If I'm going to shovel snow and say I'm going to shovel snow within 3 hours after the storm ended, am I doing that reliably? So maintenance strategy includes the people, procedures, and results. Do I know what maintenance means? Let's be honest. For most people, including most employees, people don't like doing maintenance. I would rather be out there communicating with customers and serving them than sweeping floors in the back room. I get it. I'd rather be driving around the countryside in my car than being underneath changing the oil or whatever. But the point is, everyone's got to do it. And employee involvement means not just the employees getting involved, but sharing information. So one of the keys for a lot of companies, hotels for example, is if something's falling apart, if a light bulb is out, if there's a tear in the carpet, or if something's dirty, that the employees are the ones most likely to see it, so they can report it right away and get it taken care of. And again, procedures, reliability. A lot of companies have instituted maintenance plans that says, look, if you're the employee and see garbage on the ground, just pick it up. Don't call the maintenance guy to pick up the garbage, unless it's something that's going to be, look strange in front of the customer. When you're done, if everybody's involved and you have the right procedures in place. So again, maintenance, how do you know what's right? Will the car die? You hear, some of the modern cars they talk about, you run the car for, 6,000 miles, 10,000 miles before you have to change the oil. What's the right amount for any type of maintenance that you have to have? So reliability is very simple and scary at the same time. So if I have an assembly of a number of items, the reliability of that assembly is the reliability of each component multiplied together. And you can see mathematically that curves off very quickly. And this is where the concept of Six Sigma came from. So if I look at this, if I have the average reliability of each component, N here is the number of components in the assembly. So if I have the reliability of each component across the bottom and the resulting reliability of the combined system across the left side here, if I have one component, it tracks almost exactly. If I have 10 components, it drops up very quickly. So if you think about it, if it's 96%, well, this is 96 to the 10th power. Where are you at? You're 65%. So if you think to yourself, wow, my components are really quite good. I've got 96% quality in my components. That only gives you a 65% quality if you have 10 parts. And you can see how it degrades from there. So you can see with cars, for example, the auto industry, why there was a big push for Six Sigma, or at least higher levels of quality, because car is going to have many, many, many more components than 400. So how do you keep your quality from not being zero? Well, your initial parts have to be much better. If your initial parts are close to 100%, you'll be very close to 100%. But even here, look at this, 99%. If I have 99% reliability of a component, if you walked up to somebody on the street and said, every single part I have is 99% quality, you think, well, that's pretty darn good. But then I look at this, I go, well, if I have 400 parts in the assembly, it's less than 10%. So, that's a huge deal, and thus the importance of having initial component quality. Product failure rate, again, the math behind this, number of failures divided by the number of units tested is your failure rate. And then I have mean time between failures. How much time between failures? Again, I have the failure rate times n over 1. I'm seeing about 1 divided by to give you that result. Redundancy. Obvious solution. Your car may or may not have a spare tire. A lot of processes and equipment have spare items built in. So, for example, production computers that are critical to an operation will often have 2 power supplies that are independent. Either one fails, the system doesn't even know it. Typically, I do backups of computer systems. I have 2 hard drives. One of them fails, all the data is found on the other. So here we have the model of redundancy. It gives you the mathematics associated with it. We start with the probability of the first component working, plus the probability of the second component working, times the probability of needing the second component. So this translates into the probability the first one fails. So if this is the probability of the first one working, that's 1 minus that number. So again, I can go from 80% reliability to 96% reliability by adding another device in parallel with the first. And obviously this is a simple model, so you can see the idea here of redundancy helping you. And again, the model can be very complex depending on the number of components, how you're setting up your redundancy. Included, there's another piece in here of, is there a probability that the second device will fail during the cutover? I've seen this happen where I have 2 power supplies and the switch that connects the 2 fails. So again, this can be fairly complex, but again, the idea here is that providing redundancy, think about a boat with a lifeboat. Think about a car with a spare tire. The idea of redundancy, of having people there to help out in the need of something fails. 2 types of maintenance, preventative and breakdown. Preventative is obvious. I check the air pressure in my tires. I check the tread. Breakdown is the other obvious one. I'm on the side of the road, tire's flat, I got to change it. Same idea. Hopefully you're spending more time on prevention than you are on breakdowns. Total costs of maintenance. Give you an idea of the curve here. We have 2 lines, the breakdown cost and the preventative. The model here says basically, there's a model here that says, I'm going to allow a little bit of breakdown because the prevention costs are far higher than the cost of the breakdown. Again, that's going to be a business by business decision set up on, what are the conditions? How catastrophic is the breakdown? If it's a pacemaker and I'm the patient, I don't want that thing to ever break down. I'd like to have more preventative maintenance, obviously. But then when I look at the full cost, so in general, the model, when I look at everything, tends to lean towards more prevention, less breakdown. And so the whole idea here is, I could optimize my cost by getting rid of almost all breakdowns. Plus, I'm going to have happier customers along the way. So we've covered chapters 8, 13, and 17 in this discussion. Obviously, if you have any questions, shoot me a note. And I wish you luck with the simulation this week. And I'll set up a conference call to answer any questions before the simulation starts. So I hope you have a great day, and talk to you later.